Anyone over the age of 45 knows what it feels like to realize the world is changing faster than expected. You grow up believing certain things are stable, predictable, almost permanent, until something new appears and quietly dismantles that certainty. Many of us lived through this with television, then computers, then the internet. But imagine experiencing that sensation in the middle of a war, when every technological shift does not threaten a lifestyle, but the survival of a nation itself. That was the feeling beginning to take shape in Japan when something unexpected appeared in the sky. Up to that point, air warfare followed a logic that felt understandable. Aircraft had clear limits: range, altitude, speed, payload. Defensive systems were built around those limits. Japanese commanders believed the sky was a space that could be controlled, studied, defended. There was confidence in that belief, built over years of planning and early successes. But confidence does not collapse instantly when it meets something unfamiliar. At first, it turns into denial. The earliest reports were treated exactly that way. Observers described bombers flying higher than expected, seemingly untouchable, crossing the sky as if the war below could not reach them. There was no immediate panic. There was confusion. Many assumed miscalculation, exaggeration, or fatigue from men who had been on constant alert. In wartime, rumors are common. The problem begins when the same rumor keeps returning, carrying the same unsettling details. For anyone who grew up hearing war stories from parents or grandparents, this moment is easy to imagine. It is not explosive fear. It is slow fear. The kind that starts with a simple, uncomfortable question. Why can't we reach them? That question is devastating because it does not point to a single mistake, but to a deeper failure. It suggests that something fundamental has been overlooked. And once that realization begins to settle in, simple fixes are no longer enough. At that stage of the war, Japan did not see itself as technologically inferior. On the contrary, its air force was respected, its pilots experienced, its military doctrine considered sound. The idea that an enemy could operate above all of that felt almost insulting. But war does not respect pride or tradition. It respects capability. And what was beginning to cross Japanese skies did not demand courage or sacrifice in response. It demanded something Japan no longer had in sufficient supply: time. For many Japanese civilians, as in other countries before widespread bombing began, the war still felt distant from daily life. There was suffering, there were losses, but there remained a sense of geographic separation. Oceans create illusions. The appearance of these bombers slowly shattered that illusion, not through immediate destruction, but through the realization that the enemy could arrive whenever it chose, from wherever it chose, beyond the reach of familiar defenses. Anyone who lived through the Cold War understands this kind of fear. Not fear of immediate impact, but fear of helplessness. The knowledge that something exists on the other side that you cannot stop, cannot reach, and may not fully understand. For Japan, the B-29 represented exactly that. It was not just an aircraft. It was a signal that the balance of the war was shifting at a far deeper level than individual battles. Reports began to pile up. Altitudes beyond expectations, payloads larger than predicted, ranges that seemed to ignore geography. For Japanese officers, each new piece of data reinforced the same troubling conclusion. This was not a tactical problem, but a strategic one. It could not be solved with more fighters or more guns. It required an industrial, scientific, and logistical response that could not be improvised in the middle of an ongoing war. At that point, the question was no longer how to fight these bombers, but what else the enemy possessed that had not yet been revealed. That is a dangerous question because it erodes confidence not only in the present, but in the future. Many who lived through later decades of rapid technological change recognize that feeling well, the sense of always reacting, never anticipating. This is how Japan gradually came to understand that it was facing something different. The first encounter with the B-29 was not defined by bombs alone, but by disbelief, by the realization that the rules of warfare had been altered without warning. What flew overhead was not simply an American bomber. It was a sign that the future of war had already arrived, and that Japan might not be prepared for it. After the initial shock and disbelief faded, a far more dangerous phase began, the attempt to normalize what was happening. Japanese commanders studied reports, reviewed data, and searched for explanations that still fit within what they already understood. Perhaps these bombers were operating at the extreme edge of their capabilities. Perhaps there were only a few of them. Perhaps this was a limited demonstration rather than a sustainable threat. In war, this stage of rationalization is common. It offers temporary comfort, but it exacts a heavy price when it proves false. As new missions were detected, that comfort quickly eroded. The B-29s were not only returning, they were doing so with unsettling consistency. They flew higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively reach, carried significant payloads, and returned to their bases with a regularity that pointed to something far more troubling. They were not operating at their limits. They were operating with margin. For any military force, that realization is deeply disturbing. Attempts at response followed. Fighters were pushed to the edge of their performance envelopes, engines overstressed, pilots risking everything to gain a few more meters of altitude. In some cases, contact was made. In a very small number, success followed. But each interception required perfect conditions and came at a cost that could not be sustained. This was not a solution. It was a desperate effort to prove that control still existed. And slowly, unmistakably, it became clear that these efforts would not change the broader reality. Meanwhile, civilians began to sense a shift in the air itself. Destruction was not yet widespread, but anticipation had arrived. The distant sound of engines at extreme altitude did not bring the immediate panic of conventional air raids. Instead, it planted something deeper, the feeling of powerlessness. For many Japanese citizens, this was the first real indication that war could arrive unpredictably, ignoring defenses, schedules, and expectations. Anyone who lived through later decades under the shadow of intercontinental missiles or nuclear alerts understands this feeling well. It is not fear of the impact itself, but fear of having no meaningful response. The B-29 introduced that kind of anxiety into Japan, not through constant attack, but through constant presence. A pressure that accumulated day after day, slowly eroding confidence among both civilians and military planners. Behind the scenes, Japanese engineers and strategists faced a cruel dilemma. In theory, they knew what was required: better fighters, improved radar coverage, more coordinated defenses. In practice, Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched thin. Resources were limited, time was scarce. The war demanded attention across multiple fronts. Every proposed solution arrived too late or in numbers too small to matter. The gap between what was needed and what was possible widened with each passing month. At the same time, across the Pacific, the United States demonstrated something Japan feared deeply, even if it rarely said so openly: industrial depth. The B-29 was not treated as a rare or experimental weapon. It was part of a system capable of learning, adjusting, producing, and repeating. Japan was not facing a single advanced aircraft. It was facing an industrial machine that could evolve faster than it could respond. This imbalance began to influence the tone of Japanese leadership itself. Reports became more cautious, less confident. Words like isolated and exceptional were replaced with terms such as trend and pattern. When a threat stops being viewed as an anomaly and starts being recognized as routine, something fundamental changes. The war is no longer fought on terms you chose. It is fought on terms imposed by the enemy. For Japanese pilots, encounters with the B-29 left a lasting mark, not only because of the technical difficulty of engaging them, but because of the constant sense of being one step behind. Every mission grew more dangerous, every attempt more exhausting. Air combat, once defined by skill and initiative, was becoming a struggle against numbers, machines, and physical limits that could not be overcome by will alone. By the end of this phase, an uncomfortable truth had begun to surface, even if few were willing to voice it openly. Japan was no longer confronting just a new bomber. It was confronting a different kind of war, one in which superiority came not only from the battlefield, but from the ability to apply sustained pressure without allowing the enemy time to recover. The question was no longer whether Japan could adapt, but how long it would take before this new reality became impossible to deny. Over time, what began as uncertainty and concern hardened into certainty. Japan was no longer dealing with a temporary problem or a gap in its defenses. The B-29 represented a structural shift in how war itself was being fought. It did not require immediate victory. It only needed to exist, to fly, and to return. Its repeated presence over Japanese skies was enough to wear down defenses, morale, and decision-making on the ground. For civilians, the war ceased to feel distant or abstract. Even before widespread destruction began, the sound of engines at extreme altitude carried a silent warning. There was no way to stop what was coming. Unlike earlier air attacks, there was no visible fight, no reassuring interception, no sense of control. There was only the knowledge that something could arrive without warning, and that nothing familiar could prevent it. That kind of fear, quiet and constant, is the kind that reshapes a society. Those who grew up decades later under blackout drills or the shadow of nuclear alerts during the Cold War recognize this feeling immediately. It's not the fear of impact, but the fear of helplessness, the understanding that danger does not need to strike every day to dominate daily life. The B-29 introduced that reality to Japan, not through non-stop destruction, but through the certainty of vulnerability. From a military perspective, the conclusion was even harsher. Adaptation lagged behind threat. New designs appeared, but too late. Improvements were planned, but never in sufficient scale. Modern war, as Japan was forced to realize, was no longer decided by bravery or individual skill alone, but by sustained industrial, logistical, and scientific capacity. And in that contest, the imbalance was already clear. For many Japanese pilots, the confrontation with the B-29 became an existential shock. They were not simply facing a superior enemy. They were witnessing the transformation of aerial warfare itself. Individual skill could no longer compensate for physical and technological limits. Willpower could not close the gap. It was a realization as painful as it was unavoidable. With time, the fear Japan sensed became reality. The B-29 was not an exception, it was the beginning. It represented a form of warfare rooted in deep industrial reserves, capable of absorbing losses, refining tactics, and applying pressure relentlessly. For those on the receiving end, it created the sense of always reacting, always adjusting, always arriving too late. What defines this story is not only what followed, but the precise moment when understanding set in. The moment when leaders, pilots, and civilians alike began to grasp that the question was no longer whether things would change, but how much time remained before change became absolute. That moment rarely appears in official timelines, yet it is often the true beginning of the end. Looking back today, it is tempting to reduce this history to statistics and technical diagrams. But for those who lived through it, or for those who grew up listening to first-hand accounts, it is a story about people confronting the realization that the world had moved forward faster than they could follow, that the future had arrived without permission, and that there was no way to return to what had existed before. The first encounter with the B-29 was not merely a military episode, it was a psychological turning point, a signal that victory in modern war was no longer measured only by battles won, but by the ability to impose inevitability on an opponent. A reality reinforced flight after flight, until resistance no longer felt like a choice. In the end, this story is not just about Japan or the United States. It is about how modern wars are often decided long before their final moments, about how fear changes sides when a society realizes it can no longer keep pace with its enemy, and about how defeat sometimes begins not with an explosion, but with a quiet look toward the sky and the understanding that what is coming cannot be stopped.